the show with undiplomatic takes about the foreign policy scene. I'm your host, Van Jackson. And I should note before we get into the episode today, just a quick plug. After the last episode, we'd talked about like starting a newsletter. 3 days after that episode like recorded, we started a newsletter, right? So it's just undiplomatic.com with a hyphen between the un and the diplomatic. And it's not the podcast newsletter per se, but we're going to use it's like a fucking newsletter, right? About like power politics and foreign policy. But we're going to use it to amplify episodes from the pod. There'll be a post about this episode because it's money, it's juicy. Well, you'll see. And so I just wanted to plug that. Break. Now, my guest today is similar to me in the sense that he knows what it is to wear the uniform. He's worked in intelligence, and yet he's also like staunchly anti-war, as any right-thinking person should be, presumably someone who listens to this show. He finds himself in the position of being a critic and a public intellectual and a voice of conscience from the position of having once been an agent of empire. And the reason I'm bringing him on the show today is, not just because we have some important things in common, but I'm reading this guy's work, intermittently for a number of years now, but he's just like a name to me. Like I don't know him, and I just find him like to be a really compelling writer. But then I hear he publishes this memoir, and I jump on it, and I'm able to connect with him over Twitter, and he even agrees to come on the fucking show. And the memoir, does not disappoint. So the book that I wanted to share with everyone today is called Pain is Weakness Leaving the Body, A Marine's Unbecoming. And the author of this excellent emotional read is the one and only Lyle Jeremy Rubin. Welcome to the show, brother.
I'm happy to be here, and I appreciated that very enthusiastic intro.
Yes, I'm really I feel lucky for having gotten you on the show. So this is great. Yeah. And I loved the book on the merits, but also because of the sort of personal, like sameness. I had this nauseating kind of nostalgia when I was reading it, especially the first half. I was in the Air Force, not the Marines, but the routines you described, the culture of violence and misogyny and the monotony of barracks life, it was all very similar. And even the paradox of, you have to eat shit all the time when you're in the military. It's just part of what the job is. But then somehow you also tend to think of yourself as elite and special and kind of like better than others. And that's a weird, unique kind of thing to go through. And before we get into the book per se, although it kind of, you reflect this in the book, what do you make of that? Like, how do you explain that contradiction or that paradox?
Yeah, so the first chapter actually starts off with an epigraph from John Updike. He says something like, men either want to hurt somebody or be hurt. And that's kind of like one of the themes, if not the major theme that I play with throughout the book. Like, why is this true? And in my experience, it seems to be true based on my own personal journey, but also a lot of other people I met along the way. And so if it is true, why is it true? I mean, why do men want to both hurt and be hurt more than anything else? I'm not saying all men, but certainly this is a central part, I think, of the kind of masculine, conventional masculinity that I'm writing about. So yeah, the military is kind of like the epitome of this kind of dynamic. Like you said, we're constantly eating shit, but we're constantly also telling ourselves that, we're killers, we're destroyers, we're elites, we're the upper crust of society, whatever it might be. And, I explored different possible answers to that question. But I think of a lot of it comes down to, ever since we're very young, everyone, not just men, deal with a lot of pain and a lot of difficulties and a lot of trauma. And I think at some level, either conscious or more likely subconscious, we convince ourselves that if we endure enough pain, then we can somehow become immune to it, or we can build up enough armor so that we can thrive through it and become stronger. Um, so I think to a large degree, that's kind of the animating ethos of military culture and certainly Marine culture. And yeah, I'll leave it at that for now.
Yeah, no, it's not that there's like a great answer that's available, but it was impossible to not ask that question after reading through the memoir. And like anyone who served in the military experiences that same kind of thing. So versions of that question will probably come up as we continue the conversation. I always start out asking guests to situate the audience in their biography. And for you, in some sense, obviously, because it's a memoir, the biography is the story. Like it's the lodgment for making observations and, for critique and everything. So just to get started for the listener, can you set the scene of timing and place and situation? Like, where did you grow up? When did you start college? What were the politics that you were sort of associated with at home? That kind of thing.
Sure. So I was born and raised in West Hartford, Connecticut, which is a wealthy suburb outside of Hartford, in central Connecticut. And I write about this in the book, but it was actually one of a handful of towns that Bill Clinton went to when he was first running for office in the early 90s to announce his third way politics. And for anyone who might not be entirely aware of what I mean by that, basically a politics of deunionization and free trade agreements, or really plutocratic trade agreements globally. A strong foreign policy, or what his eventual Secretary of State Madeleine Albright called, making America, or ensuring America remains an indispensable nation, basically that it maintains a monopoly of force in the world. So these were ideas that were very appealing. Oh, and also, of course, welfare reform. And these were all ideas that were very appealing to the kind of upper middle class professional type town that I was brought up in. So when I decided when I started thinking about joining the military after 9/11, I was actually 2 weeks into college when 9/11 happened. I was something of an oddity, given my own upbringing and the kind of place I went to and the kind of college I was at. So
in the 90s context, you were in a liberal space, not a conservative space.
Yes. Yeah. But, center left, 90s, Clintonite type.
Neoliberal plus like political recognition or something.
Right.
Yeah. Okay. So early in the book, you identify where like you were a college Republican, and you say you have this great quote. There was many great quotes in this book, and so I have to throw a bunch of them at you. The first one is, there was something in the Republican mindset of merciless hierarchy that made posing as a guardian of Western civilization and capitalist competition seem serious and unsentimental, end quote. And so it makes me ask, like, particularly given the sort of center-left context you were coming out of in Connecticut, and being at university anywhere is usually like a sort of left liberal experience. So why in that setting do you become a college Republican? Republicans were that I knew growing up, like I have a conservative family, was where I come from too. They embrace, clash of civilization thinking. They are romantic about like the ruthlessness of capitalism. But I don't know that they would point to those things as like why they're conservatives or why they identify as Republican. And I'm wondering like what is going on in your mind, or like how you're rationalizing to yourself being a conservative in that world, in that moment.
So yeah, I mean, like everything else, I think there was a lot that was pushing me in that direction at that time in my life. the boring answers. I was rebelling against my parents, who were, good Democrats. So I decided to become a good Republican,
Yeah.
at least for a little while. I, I also write about this, that I was, bullied as a kid, and I write especially about the kind of sexual abuse that I experienced among peers, which
Mhm.
is actually very common. And I actually think, I kind of implicitly argue that this type of violence that happens, particularly among boys, plays a role in kind of the formation of conventional masculinity, and a particularly militarized masculinity later on. And I think to some degree that was true for me. I felt like I wasn't able to defend myself, either
Mhm.
from my peers, and then also my father, who I'm very close with, and he's grown up just like I have, and I'm very grateful for that. But it was tough living in the house at times, and I write about that. So I felt, in my adolescence, and certainly going into my early 20s, that I needed to find a way to defend myself from various manly threats around me, which meant becoming a man in the most conventional sense, which for me meant joining the military. And 9/11 kind of gave me an ideological framework in which I could kind of work out this private psychodrama of mine.
Do you think if 9/11 hadn't happened, you still would have sort of emerged during the university years as a conservative?
Yeah, I mean, I actually I mean, I when I was in high school, I smoked a lot of weed, and I ended up, and it was among that group of guys where I experienced all different forms of bullying and sexual stuff. And, I ended up eventually leaving that group of friends. And there was a right wing fellow Jewish kid at the school who I ended up becoming very close with. And he introduced me to Rush Limbaugh and Dennis Prager, and, all these, right wing firebrands.
Mhm.
And so I was already moving in that direction in high school. And I was already considering myself a conservative before 9/11 happened, but 9/11 certainly pushed me more in a kind of militarized conservative direction, or at least at the foreign policy level, a neoconservative direction.
Yeah, yeah, that makes sense. I think that happened to a lot of people. Um, so you talk a bit about kind of being involved in what I would describe as like elite conservative politics. So you were, it sounds like an avid reader of sort of reactionary intellectuals for a while, like James Buchanan and Milton Friedman and Alan Bloom. And, it's kind of like a rogues gallery from my perspective of like right wing sort of scholars and pundits. And you talk about being involved with APAC, the sort of like right wing Jewish lobby. And you mentioned working for Jonah Goldberg, who famously wrote a book about liberals. I don't want to bastardize it, but it's something about like liberals being fascists. Obviously, didn't
That's
read the
not
book, but
especially bastardized, unfortunately. I mean, he would claim otherwise, but he was kind of it was he was making a one argument for his base, which was that liberals are more or less fascist, and then one argument for anyone who wasn't the base, particularly the center and the left. Like, oh no, that's not what I'm arguing. So he kind of it was a very kind of duplicitous game that I think he was playing. But yeah, I actually did research for that book.
so oh my god. So because I mean, so he's in the like same bloodstream, or I don't know what you would call it, of like the same milieu of like a Dinesh D'Souza, where it's like really wild firebrand type arguments that really paint anybody who's not conservative
Well, there's an
as
interesting. Yeah, sorry, go ahead.
no, no, good. Like I want to hear everything you have to say about this.
Yeah, I mean, it's an interesting comparison between him and D'Souza, because to be fair to Jonah, I mean, I think he hasn't. The interesting story there is that he hasn't followed the same path as D'Souza. I mean, he became a never Trumper, and is now at least mainstream enough to, be a regular on CNN. I'm not saying that says much about anyone, but he, in some ways he took a different path than D'Souza. And I think he was probably, I think, I don't want this show to be about Jonah, but I think he's a very genuine person who genuinely believes what he says and what he writes. And I think he was genuinely interested in that project, as was I. And there's actually a lot of interesting material that I ended up finding and reading about. And, ironically, it was my research for that book that first got me reading a lot of left-wing thinkers.
Really?
So, yeah. So there's a kind of irony to that as well. But
That's
yes, he
interesting.
was definitely like one of the leading kind of like shock, kind of a combination of a shock jock and a right-wing intellectual at the same time. And that's what I guess was aspiring to be at that point in my life as well.
Yeah, no, I get it. It's funny because when I was in high school, I mean, I was, in high school, people are not particularly political, especially in the 90s. But that was the first time I was exposed to Black radicalism and that strand of leftist thinking. And I was absorbing it through the context of being a avid, hip hop head. And so I was reading it with like tremendous sympathy and without a political filter. So it really was kind of like my first touch with radical thought and even like political thought other than the Rush Limbaugh shit that my parents gave me. And it didn't, and it has become resurgent in my mind, of course, the last like 5 years. But between the 90s and 2017, it's like it existed in my imagination. I had absorbed the arguments, like I knew Angela Davis and all this stuff, but it didn't have any like somehow like I discounted all of it, and then it became activated later. And it's interesting for you to say that like you were absorbing sort of some left-wing thought in this bubble in the 90s, but then also, you're filtering it through a sort of Jonah Goldberg like frame, if that's fair to say.
Yeah, I mean, I had a lot of like interesting back and forth conversations with Jonah at the time. Because basically what he was doing and what I was doing was using left-wing critiques of mainstream capitalist, imperialist liberalism.
Sounds familiar.
But yeah, redressing it up in right-wing garb. Right. I think it's actually relevant in some ways to a lot of the extremely online lefties that are strangely now in cahoots with all sorts
The
of
Red Brown Alliance stuff.
Right. So I think it's actually relevant to that in a way. And I think, again, I don't want this whole show to be like an intellectual history of left right convergence or whatever, but I think that actually speaks to like when we think the kind of received wisdom is if you go on the extreme on either side, you end up meeting. But I think Jonah became like a never Trump Republican, and was very much part of the kind of mainstream media. But a lot of the kinds of ideas that he was advancing and the arguments he was advancing were very much like, quote unquote extreme ideas or arguments of the mainstream center. So I think the relationship between the center and the extremes is much more complex than we usually allow.
Horseshoe theory is like a way of dismissing critiques of the center in a way, which is, it's almost like I don't know, if people on the right and the left are coming to common criticisms of the center, like that would almost seem like you can't discount the critique, but that's not how it's treated a lot of times. The thing I wanted to get at, though, I didn't mean to go on about Jonah Goldberg, but
it's interesting stuff. It is. I want to just to put a final point on this. A lot of the arguments in liberal fascism are now arguments that are just common fare on the far right. So the idea that liberals are fascists, that they're the true authoritarians, that the entire corporate capitalist state is in fact some kind of communist or socialist state that needs to be totally, violently overthrown. You can see the kernels of a lot of that in Jonah's book. I think it's interesting that he did not become one of those far right people later on, even though that's more or less where his arguments pointed. And D'Souza kind of did, in a way, kind of bring to fruition the kind of implied arguments of Jonah's own book.
Yeah, took it to the logical conclusion almost.
Yeah.
Did you? So my real point was that like you were not an armchair conservative. You weren't some like rhino. You weren't an armchair conservative. You were very directly in touch with the bloodstream of conservative politics, and so you were kind of living it in a way. And so now that you're on the other side of the fence, or you've like turned radical, or however you want to phrase it, did you lose all those friends? Are you in touch with any of those people? Do you talk to Jonah, for example, still? That you've constructed a whole social world around that, and that's what happens. Like I did the same thing with the national security world. Like that's where all my friends were, and I'm gradually like losing those friends,
Sure.
but not all of them. And so I'm like wondering if how in touch you are with the conservative, social network you used to be part of.
Yeah, so I'm the kind of person that tries to keep like friendships or really any kind of relationships as long as I can. I don't like, some people kind of take a weird kind of joy in cutting off friendships or relationships. And I just struggle with that a lot.
Yeah.
No, I'd much rather, at least keep some channels, going regardless of
if possible. Yeah.
How much we're diverging politically or intellectually. With Jonah, Jonah was always he's a nice guy. He was a good boss. And he helped me out a lot, in the early years of my young adulthood. And I think we just kind of drifted for like a variety of reasons that went beyond just political. I kind of drifted from the world that he was a part of, like not just the right-wing world, but just kind of like just that kind of DC centered media universe. I moved more in like, I eventually ended up moving more in an academic direction. But politics obviously had something to do with it as well. I mean, he would approach me once in a while or send me an email and ask if I wanted to be part of this or that political project. And it was clear at that point that we just didn't share the same politics. So that's what happened with Jonah. To your broader question, I did. I've lost friends, and I still, there's a part of me that hopes that I can like, restart some of those friendships in some way, maybe down the line. There are some people that I was close with who have just moved so far to the right and are just so violent and so, just so opposed to like everything that I have become and those around me have become, and the way I would like to live my life. I just don't see us, returning to any kind of friendship anytime soon. But no, it's incredibly painful. And, the flip side of that is because I have such a hard time like cutting off friendships, I have stayed in touch with a lot of folks, some of them who are right wing and have voted for Trump and all the rest. Not a lot of them, but there's a few that I try to like, keep, like I said, keep a channel out there so that we can still talk this stuff out if and when the time comes.
Yeah. So I joined the military for a bunch of reasons. The overriding one was kind of that I had no life prospects otherwise. My parents had no college money for me. I had a partial scholarship in Florida, but I didn't have admission to any school because I didn't apply to any schools. I didn't know how. Before the age of Googling, it was actually, you had to like know somebody to like, or get help somehow to like figure out how to apply to a college. And like, there were other motives going on, but the prospect of poverty overrode my fears of kind of leaping into the military. And I seriously, genuinely thought from a place of ignorance that I was going to die. And I still did it anyway. Like, I thought basic training was going to kill me. And I still did it anyway. Because I had like, what my thought was like, what am I going to fall back on? What else? What else am I going to do? But you acknowledge, like, and that is one way in which we're very different, I think. You know, your background, comfortable, Connecticut, you know? So what's going on there? Like, why did you do it? And I know it's not necessarily a simple question.
Yeah, no, I mean, this is something I struggle with because, you know, I consider myself a socialist. I write about capitalism for the public and in more academic work. So I'm like well aware of, you know, what most people call the poverty draft. And I think that's probably like, if you were to force me to pick like one reason why people join the military, I would say it's social economic. You know, the very conditions of capitalism guarantee, to paraphrase Marx in another context, the reserve army of the poor. And you know, he was talking about the unemployed, but I think you have a very similar dynamic when it comes to a lot of people that sign up. You know, and it's not just people that literally have no money at all. It's also, you know, the middle class in this country has been entirely hollowed out. So much of what is still considered the middle class consists of people that are desperate for healthcare benefits and educational benefits, and you know, and enough of an income so that they can buy a home someday. So you're talking about, you know, 60 to 70, you know, depending on the time of the year, upwards to 80% of our society, where the military, especially if you're young, is quite an appealing option relative to the alternatives in the political economy we have. But I guess, you know, what I kept on telling myself, and I still tell myself, although with some ambivalence, is that I guess I wanted to, because I feel like the poverty draft dynamic is something that a lot of people know about and talk about. And it tends to, I think, focus on poor working class and, like I said, like precarious middle class people. But I think the imperialist project, you know, or the militarist project, but I would argue it's really a project of empire. You know, much of that project, if not all of it, is being managed and directed by the privileged, by you know, either the super rich or the upper middle class. Those are the people making the policy. Those are the people writing arguments in favor of the policies, creating media narratives that are friendly to the policies. So I wanted to kind of, I figured I was in this unique opportunity to offer a kind of military memoir that actually, you know, aims most of its ire or its interest at, you know, the actual economic, social, political elites, while telling a military story.
Yeah, it's hard, particularly if you're like a historical materialist or something. Like, it's hard not to sympathize with a worker's situation, regardless of what it is, you know. And that kind of perspective kind of forces you to look at and or be critical of the elites. To this point, you know, when you were in OCS, Officer Candidate School, I think you describe yourself as being surrounded by men, quote, who had once been made to feel weak or inadequate, not so much in search of freedom and democracy as of their manhood, end quote. So I like double underlined that when I read it, because the noble abstract reasons why, like, most of us say that we join the military, I find like that is, I've said those kinds of noble things before about why I join. And they're not false. It's just that, like, there's a hierarchy of reasons, and the like abstract nobility of serving empire or the national purpose or whatever, or the ruling class, like, that's not high on the list of things that push pushes you, you know? And like self-sacrifice to nation was not, I wasn't like, I gotta self-sacrifice right now, and that's why I gotta do it, you know? But it wasn't absent from the picture either. And so like, it sounds like you're kind of talking about a complex basket of motives and you don't want to reduce it to the poverty draft. Is that fair?
Yeah, like I think, I mean, our political economy, or capitalism, and particularly the extreme form of capitalism that we have, is just so dire that it's always the elephant in the room. I mean, you
Mm-hmm.
like, and I think it's important to like always remember that that like the way that we organize like both the production, distribution, like consumption of all material things in this society is just so unbelievably brutal, and it leaves most of the population with like such unbelievably few options, that like we should never lose sight of that.
Yeah.
But I think that there is an officer corps, and the officer corps, for the there's exceptions, but for the most part it's people with 4-year college degrees. So if you're talking about
Yeah.
people with 4-year college degrees, those tend to be people that are either middle class or upper middle class and or wealthy. And so I think the poverty draft doesn't fully answer the question that
Yeah.
I pose. Like why did I decide to join up? Why did a lot of fellow officers decide? And there's also enlisted people that come from more comfortable backgrounds. So why did they decide to join up? And then even among people that don't come from much, and it was just a good kind of practical option for them. I don't think it's just the economic. Like I think there also is other stuff going on. And I do think a lot of it has to do with the ways that young people, and particularly boys, are made to feel, both simultaneously defenseless, and also always feeling the need to be strong because they're defenseless and to prove their strength.
Yeah.
And if they prove it enough, then they'll no longer have to worry about, like as I said earlier, all sorts of threats, usually from other men, but not always. So yeah, I think I had political reasons for why I joined, but I think ultimately, if you would ask me now, I would say that I wanted to become, a man. As I've described it elsewhere, joining the military is a very obvious and common ticket to manhood and manliness. And
Yeah. No, I mean, when I was growing up, I was around gangs and stuff, and I was terrified of going to school every day. And I was, so I resonated with me, the Karate Kid, fucking Daniel LaRusso, because I grew up in his actual shitty apartment building in Reseda. Like I lived
oh
there for a
wow,
few years. Like
yeah,
I'm actually like the poor valley kid, and I had to deal with that kind of like I'm not aware of class, but I'm on the bottom rung of the class ladder, and like that kind of life, and being surrounded by gangs in Central Florida later, and like so I ended up turning to fighting and martial arts as a practical thing, just like fucking Daniel Russo, but also because like you got to be a man. It's all about like manning up, you know?
yeah,
And there's
sure.
this sense that like you simultaneously do the pragmatic thing by learning how to defend yourself and to fight and to kill while also achieving a kind of virtue, like a masculine virtue. And these things all good things go together, you know? Um, and I've never really known how to think about that or admit it, even that like masculinity and like the psychosexual stuff is somehow in there. And I've never had a way to think about it, to be honest. But like you've got the psychosexual stuff all through that memoir, man.
Yeah.
You place you that seems to be in your bag of motivations for sure.
Oh yeah, definitely. It's funny that you see yourself as kind of the Karate Kid. I don't blame you. It seems like your story is like almost identical. But it's funny because when I eventually, so for those of you who haven't read the book, which I imagine is almost everyone listening to this, I first went to officer candidate school because I had a college degree. I got flushed out. I didn't make it through, and then I went to boot camp. So I did the enlisted route.
So you were enlisted and an officer. Like, that's
Yeah,
important to note too.
and then I became an officer later on, like a year and a half after being enlisted.
Yeah.
I went back to officer candidate school and became an officer. But anyways, while I was at boot camp, the senior drill instructor used to, he was Mr. Miyagi, and we were his, what is it, Miyagi-san? Is that? I forgot. Yeah.
Daniel-san Miyagi.
Yeah. So he used that kind of like iconic, narrative throughout the boot camp process, and I've heard
he invoked it.
Oh yeah, he did. Oh yeah, he would we would literally be doing, like, it didn't matter what we were doing. He's like, wax on, wax off. Like, it was like kind of like a running joke, and it was funny. But going back to what you were saying beyond just the Karate Kid element, I do want to say, and I try to get at this a little bit in the book, that I don't think I think it's both understandable and even inevitable that something like this journey to manhood is going to happen. And I don't necessarily mean like in the most literal or like most conventionally gendered sense, but this idea that like we all have to kind of learn how to be tough in a very difficult, brutal world. Yeah. Like, I think that there's obvious legitimacy to that and necessity to it. But I guess what I'm interested in is how ruling classes, how the powerful, and specifically how the military machine, the war machine, and the broader kind of economic system that war machine is servicing, like how they use this psychosexual drive in most of us, and particularly
it's something they exploit,
aspiring men, and how they use that to kind of convince us that the best way we can become a man is by becoming a weapon on behalf of, very rich, distant, forces or people that, would never dare pick up a weapon and walk through a minefield.
Yeah. There was, I forgot to fucking underline it. I didn't bring it with me, but you have like a page. There was like a whole page I wanted to quote that I don't have, where you describe all the ways in which the idiom of marine life is basically just all penises all the time. And it was so funny, and I can't fucking remember it now, but it was very good. One of many reasons to read the book. So let's go.
Oh yeah, I mean, I have the book with me. I could read that section, but we have limited time, so maybe
I don't want to burn your clock.
I'll just let that way everyone will be forced to read the book just to read the section on the penises.
Yes, read the penis.
Yeah.
So this is not a tangent, but the next logical question. You mentioned in the memoir that there are these two traits of boot camp that you end up talking a lot about when you're on the anti-war circuit. And it's dehumanization and depersonalization. So what's going on there? Why do you see those concepts as important, or / problematic in the context? You have this great quote: to dehumanize anyone is to dehumanize everyone. And I think that has to be true. So take it away.
Yeah. I mean, when I first started doing counter recruitment work in mostly high schools and some colleges, I basically was just in search of material. Like, because I remember the first time I showed up and I had no idea what I was going to say. Yeah. And after that, I was like, oh shit, I really actually have to like do my prep work. I mean, it was actually a good, the first time I did it, it actually worked out pretty well, but I was very interested in kind of like honing my craft after that. So, there's this famous, notorious book on killing, which you might be familiar with.
I bought it when I was 17.
Yeah, exactly. And it was huge. I think it's still huge, but it was definitely huge when we were coming up in the military. And it's a book on basically the conditioning of soldiers, Marines, and recruits in the military, and basically, this guy who was he was a ranger. He was an Army Ranger. I don't think he was a Green Beret, but he was a Ranger definitely. But he never saw combat, which is interesting. But he basically is asking like, how do you convince people to like kill other people? And he talks about this famous study by SLA Marshall, who was this World War II era general, which concluded that the overwhelming majority of frontline troops during World War II on the Allied side did not actually fire directly at the enemy. They either didn't fire at all, or they fired to the right or the left, above, below. And how the military, like once they stumbled on these findings, were terrified of this, and they said, holy shit, we have to like really redo our whole training regimen so our frontline soldiers are actually doing what they're supposed to be doing, which is not wasting bullets and killing people, and then you eventually end up with the saying, one shot, one kill. So, to some degree, it was me talking about dehumanization and depersonalization. I'm basically just borrowing from Grossman's book, that basically like this was like a very deliberate conditioning process on the part of the United States government and other governments around the world, where you first have to basically suck out all the individuality or personality of each recruit. So you do that by not allowing them to speak in the first person. So we always spoke in the third person. This recruit requests permission to go to the head, sir. This recruit requests permission to speak, sir. Whatever it may be, you always speak in the third person. The thinking there was that when you're actually in combat or when you're in a war zone, if you're thinking as an individual, like things aren't going to go well for you, and more importantly, they're not going to go well for your comrades all around you. That you have to really think as one coherent, single organism, and you have to kind of behave as one single organism. And so depersonalization is a major part of that conditioning. And then on top of that, you need to be convinced not only that you aren't really a unique individual as you were raised to be, but also that the person that you're being tasked with killing or policing is also kind of drained of whatever subjectivity they might have. So this conditioning is all about making sure that you're not asking all these inconvenient questions when you're actually, on the front lines. Questions like, does this person I'm aiming my M4 at, like, do they have some of the same fears I have? I wonder what they did when they were a kid. Are they a kid now? I wonder what their, romantic life might be like. What are their anxieties? If you start asking the kinds of questions that you ask of someone who is a fellow human being, it makes it much harder to pull the trigger. And I guess I kind of use this, which is all very common knowledge at this point among the military brass, certainly, and the foreign policy elite, that this is just how the conditioning works in basically every military in the world at this point. I argue that this type of conditioning goes beyond just military training. That in some sense, this is the conditioning of the society that we live in, and that we're all being trained in one way or another to dehumanize certain groups of people, and to also at times dehumanize ourselves. I say that, if you dehumanize anyone, you dehumanize everyone. And I think that's because dehumanization is not a surgical, like very like targeted thing. It's very hard to control once you start, like a weapon. It's very hard to use it in any really controlled manner. You end up hurting people that you don't want to hurt. And in the process, you often end up getting hurt, either physically or psychologically, in the process of this kind of dehumanization. I think our society as a whole is very much a kind of, not just a war machine, but a dehumanization machine.
You just can't keep it. Well, the thing that your quote captured so well, I thought, was like this: you can't severance this kind of dehumanization, like problem, like the us them thing. Eventually, means you have to apply the us them thing to us. Like you can't actually contain this the dehumanization of another person so that you can kill them. And that seems to be the false premise on which like the larger militarized foreign policy apparatus is built, that you can keep the us them contained. The them is there. If we're going to drop bombs and go to thousands are going to die, it's going to be there, not here. But like it literally hasn't worked that way. Like the war comes home.
Right. I mean, once you're trained to dehumanize someone and specifically kill someone, that stays with you. And you come home and the way your brain is working now, the way that your psychology is working is very much geared toward the very, dehumanizing modes of thought and action that that had conditioned you for so many years. And there's a wonderful book, or I should say important book, Bringing the War Home by Kathleen Belew.
Yeah.
About this very long and unfortunate history of military veterans playing central roles, leading roles in far right violent politics in the United States. And there's a lot of reasons for that, but one of them comes back to like, once you're trained to kill, once you're trained to dehumanize, when you come home, that doesn't stop. And I wish it's something that we accounted for. I mean, the military, the government loves to be about accountability and calculating everything. They've got economists on both sides of them at all times. But I wish we could maybe factor in those types of costs, those types of long-term costs of a militarized society.
Yeah. My evolution from implicitly, I didn't think about it in this way, but like liberal national security primacist to being, right now, a pretty outspoken anti-war person. It was very gradual, right? I can remember specific moments, like maybe 10 or so over the last decade, that were kind of pivotal, or like they tilted me in one way or another, but nothing decisive about this like transformation that I've had. And so when it comes to was your own transformation, would you characterize it as more like of an arc or more punctuated? Or was there a moment or a few moments that really were decisive for you that you can remember?
So I try to make it clear that like it was also a slow going process for me too. That it was really that in the moment I showed up at officer candidate school, my own kind of self or collection of cells was already kind of being broken up into 1,000 little pieces. And the rest of the book is about what I do with this, how I reorganize those pieces throughout the training, and how I've tried to reorganize those pieces ever since. And then when I finally make it to Afghanistan, the name of that chapter is kind of like facetiously called Turning Point. But, because I think a lot of times if you haven't been in the military, you haven't been at war, I think that, and even if you have, it's kind of assumed that if you do have any kind of political turning point in the military, it's when you go to war. It's the war that does it. And there's obviously, you cannot, downplay like the role of the actual war itself in these types of conversion experiences. But you actually have a lot of people in the military that never go to war, and they have radical conversions, conversion experiences, politically, intellectually, spiritually, what have you. And even those that do go to war, I think it's more of a gradual process. I think the training itself is radical. If we didn't live in a society, we wouldn't just like wake up in the woods one day and be like, I am going to train myself to be the most efficient killer of other human beings You're probably more interested in finding comfortable shelter and food, and maybe building some nice relationships with people around you. And I think that's even the case today for most people.
Mhm.
Military conditioning itself is a radical experience. And the way we talk about PTSD and all sorts of mental health issues in the military, it's often focused on combat. And I think, again, combat is extremely traumatizing, and for very like chemical reasons, like TBI and so on.
Mhm.
But military conditioning itself is going to guarantee a critical mass of mentally unwell people. And the more militarized your society is, the more mentally, emotionally, psychologically unwell people you're going to end up with. And I don't think that that's a conversation that we have even begun to have in this country.
Yeah. Yeah. And we're living with the consequences now. Um, so midway through your own transformation, kind of from right to left, you talk about your disillusionment with the war in Iraq. It wasn't going well, obviously, but you say specifically, this is kind of a long quote, but to the extent I was becoming critical of the war in Iraq, it wasn't with the aid of the Chomskyite left, but with that of Henry Kissinger and company. I was exploring the possibility with my friends that perhaps the US had to either go full fascist or get out. My neoconservative idealism appeared at times to be souring into an authoritarian pulp. End quote. So, you know, in the early days of going from like Obama to Trump, I had almost exactly that kind of thought. And I was in a bunch of conversations with the national security technocrat crowd that were of a similar vein, like, well, maybe the Victorian Empire wasn't so bad, like fucking nutty stuff. And there really was this period of time that, like, if I had to chronologize it, it was maybe 5 or 6 months in that 2016, 2017 timeframe where I avoided looking left in favor of like crude realpolitik kind of center right criticisms of the status quo. And it didn't take long for me to realize that that shit was an intellectual cul-de-sac and to come to terms. But what was going on in your mind in this era for you of like non-left disillusionment with war and the status quo? And then secondary question, like, do you think that neoconservatives are primed in some way for like fascism?
God, I think there's like so many different ways I want to answer that question. Um,
Go for it.
so I guess I'll start at the most basic level, that I was a true believer. I had
Mhm.
written a number of articles for my newspaper, for the Atlanta Journal-Constitution, for other publications.
In the neocon cause, like in war.
Yeah.
Yeah.
That we were bringing democracy to the greater Middle East, which,
Mhm.
as I say that, I just like, I'm just so embarrassed by that fact that I
I know what
really
you mean.
did
Yeah.
that. But I really did. And I think I was somewhat unique in that among my military peers. Like you said, I mean, most people are not signing up because they believe in the ideological mission, but I did. And the time that I'm writing about, things are not going well, and it's becoming increasingly clear that, to the extent that I still believe that we were bringing democracy to Iraq and to Afghanistan, that was not actually happening. And I was trying to somehow rationalize this defeat, basically, and this
Mhm.
this kind of subconscious awareness that I was wrong. Um, and I think I was angry, and I think I wanted some kind of answer that wouldn't allow me to do the real work that needed to be done, which was confronting, you know, the guiding, overriding ideology that I had embraced, and the overall political culture that I embodied in a lot of ways. So the easier way out was kind of, like I say, like trending toward this kind of desire for like an authoritarian pulp, that that, if they're not, if these people aren't going to accept our democracy with welcome arms, then we're going to force it on them, whatever, by whatever means necessary. And do I think that kind of thinking has fascist potential? Of course it does. And does it have fascist roots? Of course it does. Neoconservatism, to a large degree, is another chapter in the annals of European empire, and you've had similar kind of thinking throughout throughout the imperialist tradition, if you want to think of it like that. And fascism itself, if you read like the Black intellectual tradition, if you read like really like M. Césaire and who wrote an incredibly small little book that I highly recommend everyone read, called Discourse on Colonialism.
Yeah.
He makes this argument, and a lot of other people do as well, that fascism was basically the returning of imperialist methods on the periphery to the core, to the metropole. And there's a way in which you can look at the present moment and see how the kind of increasing fascist-like politics or far-right authoritarian politics on the right, and see that history, if it's not repeating, then it is rhyming yet again. And I think this is going back to the Jonah Goldberg conversation. Like, I think a lot of never Trumpers and people in the center want to pretend that there was this pristine conservatism or right-wing politics, and then Trump kind of interrupted it and moved the movement in an entirely different direction. Well, of course, that's flatly, it doesn't make sense. I mean, why was he able to move it in such a radically different direction? I mean, certainly there was material there for him to work with, but I think there's a direct line. If you read Spencer Ackerman's, another very important book,
Reign of Terror,
on the history of the war on terror, he makes this argument explicit that there's a direct line from the neoconservatism, and even to some degree, unfortunately, the liberal hawkishness of the early 2000s, the post 9/11 policy generation, and the far right politics that we are now contending with.
Yes, I want to circle back to that in a second, because that's a rich area to talk about, actually. But I had this notion that I wanted to bring up and pose to you as a question. A buddy of mine, Mike Horowitz, he's a scholar at Penn, but he's actually in the Biden administration right now. He wrote a book about why leaders go to war, and he's a quant, so it's like convoluted, but he argued that the greatest predictor of whether a leader would be like a foreign policy hawk, basically, was if they served in the military but not served in combat. And his explanation was like, it's that group of people that like didn't see the full price of war, but were immersed in the lifestyle, and like it made them kind of fetishize it all, right? And I wonder what you think of that hypothesis, because it makes sense to me generally, but if you apply it to like me and you, it means we should be like arch neocons, right? Which is obviously not the case. And then in the book, you talk about, in your time in Afghanistan, you say specifically, quote, explosions were regular and the combat was minimal. I was more a spectator than a participant, end quote. And so, you're talking about how very few people elsewhere in the book also like very few people were engaged in direct combat in the way like our imagination would conceive of direct combat. That was really like mostly a special forces kind of thing. And so why do you make that observation? And in the context of the book, but also in the context of this like Mike Horowitz thing I'm talking about.
Sure. I'm about to sneeze, so just
No
forgive me or maybe I'm not going to sneeze. First of all, I want to read Horowitz's research. That sounds fascinating. And I think there's also a part of me that wonders if these types of people that were in the military but didn't actually see combat, there's this kind of overcompensation going on. It's not just that they're absorbing the militaristic culture, but they are doing that. But on top of that, they have something to prove that they weren't able to prove while they were in, and maybe they can prove it now by actually like leading a war
Or like the chicken hawk kind of thing.
heights, yeah, at the heights of command. You know, if they can't fight it on the front lines, at least they can exercise or perform their masculinity at the heights of power. But you know, that's just me spitballing. But in answer to your question, yeah, so I was a signals intelligence officer when I went to Afghanistan, and I kind of had this very like dichotomous deployment where I was either behind a desk at a regimental base, or I was visiting a number of my team Marines who were a combination of linguists and like techies, who were accompanying frontline troops, mostly infantry, but sometimes other units as well, on missions. And a lot of times that just meant like going on foot patrols and basically walking through minefields, you know, just basically turf that was just lined with IEDs. Sometimes it included raids and more high speed Hollywood like stuff, but it was mostly just like waiting to get blown up while walking. And that is, I think, a fair generalization of much of the wars that we fought in both Iraq and Afghanistan for a lot of frontline troops. There was combat. Sometimes there was really, really awful, lethal combat. But I think the more likely scenario for most frontline soldiers was walking through a minefield or something akin to that. Also, vehicle mobile missions where you're also waiting to get blown up by IEDs, while going from point A to point B. So, yeah, like, I mean, I guess I've forgotten the original question at this point, but I think this is like, you know, I can go into like a psychoanalytic read of this as well. Like, I think that this kind of like absence of Hollywood-like combat for most of us, unless you're special forces, in a way kind of fuels the fire, because it makes everyone all the more eager to see combat and to find ways to see combat and to become heroes. Like, I've actually been thinking about this a lot lately, that like one way of thinking of like the psychological like economy of American militarism is like, it's all about creating the conditions in which men, largely white men, can become heroes, either as like frontline soldiers or as like policy hawks, or even as just like wealthy capitalists who can, you know, basically create a system in which they end up with most of the capital and then generously hand over a portion of that to people in heroic fashion that are struggling, and live out their own kind of heroism fetish that way. But I think, you know, instead of like creating a heroic society, one in which we're not always at war, and we're not always relying on philanthropists to guarantee that some poor kid has food on the table. That to me would be a heroic society. We're creating conditions that are actually very miserable, but allow a few people to enjoy their heroic moments.
Yeah, that was one of the interesting things about the flavor, the emotional imprint of the book too, is like you describe all kinds of trauma that's happening in all kinds of ways, including to you, but you as a reflection of like the larger mass of people who serve in the military too. And the trauma that you're talking about, for the most part, is not the trauma that we think of in like the Hollywood sense. It's not like my buddy caught a bullet in the leg, or I watched my buddy's brain get blown out in front of me. You know, it's not like the Vietnam kind of thing or World War I trenches kind of thing. It's like there's some of that going on, but a lot of the trauma is outside of this space of direct combat. And it's not only equally legitimate, but it's like the part we don't talk about or imagine to the same degree, I guess, or like you can't glamorize it, you know?
and even the firefights themselves, like you're operating on such unequal ground. Like it's not just, two
The war as
smash.
told from the Galactic Empire's
Yeah, yeah,
perspective.
yeah,
Like,
yeah, yeah. I mean, usually a lot of time the way these firefights happen is, first of all, they often happen at quite a distance. There's very little, hand-to-hand combat that's going on. There is, again, a lot of times special forces are not kicking down doors, and grunts are doing that as well. But often a lot of these firefights, take place. There's quite a distance between the fighters, and one side has access to air support and the other doesn't.
yeah,
And usually what ends, if the firefight gets hot enough, then air support comes in and blows up a shit ton of people.
yeah,
So even the actual combat, there's something like so anti-masculine about it in the conventional sense,
yeah,
because it's such a bully's game in a way. I know I don't want to. I want to make it very clear that there are so many, even though it is a bully's game, there are so many, um, fighters on the imperialist side that are still losing limbs, and losing lives, and losing their friends. Of course there are.
structurally it's a bully's
Right,
game.
but
Yeah,
structurally it's a bully's game. And I even think that, like, at some level, like, most war fighters end up getting that, and I think that fucks with our heads. Like, like a common refrain I heard a lot from, like, people, like Marines mostly, but also other people I met along the way when I was in Afghanistan, is like they would say something like, yeah, like, I actually have a lot of respect for these guys who are fighting. Like, they don't have air support, or they don't have any of these armored vehicles, and, like, they all they have is their AK-47s, and like, like one meal a day, or however they phrased it. I mean,
yeah,
there was a kind of respect for the people that they were fighting, precisely because they knew that they had it a lot worse in a lot of ways. And yeah, I mean, this is the sort of thing that often gets lost in the kind of mainstream dramatization of modern American war.
yeah. Um, so I wondered, this was the thing I wanted to circle back to, like, if you could talk about alienation a bit, because it comes through in your memoir, and you're obviously familiar with, like, the way Marxists think about alienation in relation to capitalism, right? So it's like capitalism alienates us from our labor, from each other. We get atomized, and that I'm not. I don't necessarily mean in that sense. Like, I experience. We sort of touched an aspect of this already, but, like, you know, I experienced alienation, like, in a very deep, weird way when I started seeing the world differently and kind of coming out of Plato's cave when it comes to, like, the what Trump showed about our politics and our foreign policy. Like, it gradually became undeniable to me that there were root causes to the problems of oppression and inequality and insecurity in the world, and these things are related, right? And the smartest among us in, like, the technocratic sphere are kind of being trained to avoid asking the right questions. Like, we're trained to avoid seeing these connections. And so when I started seeing Trump as a symptom rather than some, like, weird anomaly, that had, like, big policy implications, right? Things we got to do differently now to make the world less shitty. And I went on that ride of awakening kind of alone. Like, my technocrat friends did not come with me. And they're still, I mean, most of them are in the Biden administration. Like, they're getting a psychic wage out of American exceptionalism in spite of all evidence to the contrary, and that's possible because they don't see a connection between what we're protesting with BLM and Israeli apartheid. They don't see a connection between the war on terror and the birth of Trumpism. They don't know who Spencer Ackerman is, right? So, like, how do you think about alienation? Did you experience any of that? And, like, was any of that part of the trauma that you had coming out of Afghanistan?
Yeah, it's another one of those questions where there's a lot of different ways I want to approach it, but um, I do think that military conditioning again is the another kind of common phrase you hear a lot is like boot camp is about breaking you down so we can build you back up again.
Yeah.
So right off the start, right from the beginning, you are talking about a very like violent form of alienation where like you're not only being like separated from yourself, you're pulverizing yourself and you're being replaced by something other than a self. And again, this is why I talk about this kind of conditioning as a very radical process that our society has not even really begun to come to terms with. And but I think that's kind of the most obvious blatant form of the kind of alienation you're driving at. But I think throughout, you're also being, in a lot of ways, you're being torn or wrested from wherever you come from. And to some degree, I'm not saying that that's entirely bad. Like for a lot of people, like they don't like where they come from and they have good reasons for not liking where they come from. And the military gave them an opportunity to go other places and see other things and
clean slate. Yeah.
Yeah. And they didn't have a good family or they had not much of a family at all. And the military gives them a family. So I think it's very important to like acknowledge the full range of experience. My book focuses on the most like devastating aspects of it, because I think those are the parts we don't focus on. Like we do know, most Americans do know the military gives a lot of opportunity to people. Most Americans do know that it allows a lot of people to kind of enjoy kind of families or family-like communities that they didn't have before. Yeah.
It made me. I mean, like I owe my life career to the national security state.
Absolutely.
I just got some mixed feelings about it.
Absolutely right, and I think there's a famous essay by William James, the psychologist philosopher, called The Moral Equivalent of War. And it's outdated in a lot of ways. I think he kind of romanticizes the very kind of pain-fueled masculinity that I'm calling into question. But he's right on the main point. His main point is that to the extent that war must be defended, it's because of this kind of solidarity building that war tends to generate. But of course, the costs of war and the costs of militarism usually end up outweighing the benefits. So the question he poses is, can we have a substitute for war that builds and ensures this kind of solidarity and these types of opportunities that we often find in war? And there's been all sorts of attempts across the political spectrum to answer this question. I think the best answer, at least in a capitalist society, is social movements, the labor movement, the women's movement, trans rights, migrant rights, whatever, racial justice, abolition, whatever it is that you find the need to like act in solidarity with like-minded people. Like, I think that's where the solidarity building needs to take place. And, it doesn't, if you're not someone who's especially political or someone who for whatever reason doesn't feel comfortable in any of those types of circles, like you can have all sorts of kinds of like less political or less radical forms of solidarity that are healthy. It can be families that aren't, bloodline families. It can be communities of really any kind that don't involve killing people and policing people.
So, no, that's good. I wasn't planning to ask this, but you just like triggered a memory of myself. I get like, I'm reading you very selfishly, right? Like I'm reading you and loving it, but it's because it's like, oh, I'm getting to see things of myself again,
No, please do. I was selfish enough writing this damn book. The least I can ask for is other people to indulge in their selfishness a little bit while reading it. So I know
The
I
fact that you
wanted to
can do
teach
that
other
though is
people's
important.
experiences.
Yeah, like that's actually a sign that you've succeeded here. So you talk like as soon as you got out of the military, you kind of, hit a beat all the way to the West Coast. You were doing like this Pacific Coast road trip, and you were like stopping with friends in California, and it sounded like maybe Oregon or Washington State or something like that. You describe, it's a very brief part of the memoir, but you describe that sliver of time as like very refreshing, seeing society and community that exists completely apart from the war experience. And so like, can you just reflect on that? Because like when I was living in DC and working in the national security bubble, I used to escape with my wife every chance we got to California, specifically on the vibe, because
Yeah.
it was 180 different, or like it felt 180 different. And like that was like part of a germination that led to like, I got to get the fuck out of here. And so I'm wondering like if you can just reflect on if that period of time meant something specific to you, like being in California and that kind of thing.
Yeah, I mean, a cousin that I'm very close with, she wasn't married to her wife yet, but they were I believe living together at this point when I got out of the Marine Corps. Actually,
Hmm.
my first tattoo I got with that they accompanied me in San Diego. This is like before I got out of the Marine Corps, so I became very close. I was already close with my cousin. I became close with her future wife. But spending time, I got out and the first thing I did was head up to San Francisco to spend some time with them before I drove across the country. And it was a queer scene in San
Yeah.
Francisco, and like that itself, like going from like the Marine Corps, which is also very much a queer scene, but in a much less healthy way a lot of the
Yeah.
time. But going from like an unhealthy queer scene, repressed queerness in the Marine Corps to expressed queerness and loving queerness in San Francisco and hanging out with my cousins and all these other good people. Like that was, it was quite the transition or quite the culture shock.
Did it
And
give you space to explore more of like building an identity that was disconnected from war and that kind of thing? Or
I mean, at the time, I wasn't like thinking in these terms. I was more interested
right.
in like, the next beer that I was gonna drink for the night. Or in that case, it was actually we went to a really good Irish whiskey place. So
Yeah.
before I totally blacked out, I was thinking about what my next Irish whiskey would be. Um, but I certainly in retrospect, like I think there was a part of me that was like, huh, like you can be totally free in this world. Like you don't need to perform uh these very like constricting, often violent or threatening or menacing forms of masculinity. You can perform the opposite. You could perform loving kindness and fun spiritedness. And again, like I'm speaking in very simplistic terms, and the military has a lot of loving kindness and a lot of free spiritedness, especially free spiritedness, I would say,
Mm-hmm.
in certain contexts. But it also has all the stuff I'm talking about.
Yeah.
And it was that stuff that I struggled with while I was in, and I continued to struggle with. And it was nice to enjoy that time in San Francisco, and then I was in Portland, and then I was in Seattle as well, and just hanging out with a lot of different types of people as I drove across the country, and was reminded of like just the vast diversity of being that is out there, and of humanity that is out there, and that most of it doesn't involve killing or training to kill or threatening to kill. Um, so yeah.
Yeah. No, that's interesting. I vibe with it. Um, so I don't know when you would start when I mean it sounds so you were already reading like, leftist thinkers back when you were a right winger. But then I don't know how much that was going on during your military years. I don't know what you had in your book bag as you were up and down the California coast, but like, who were the you mentioned Cesar already and William James, but who were other like people who influenced you intellectually on this political evolution? You're piecing together a coherent worldview, you know, bit by bit. Who's guiding you on that intellectually?
Oh wow. Well, I'm like a total book geek, so like I could go on for like 2 hours just answering that question. I mean, I was reading so much at the time. I mean, it
Mm-hmm.
was mostly I was still operating from like the white Western male canon for the most part. I was starting to spend more time, and I mentioned these figures a bit in the book. Like I really started like wanting to read more women while I was in the Marine Corps. I was just surrounded by men,
Mm-hmm.
and like reading women or anyone who wasn't a man was liberating at that time in my life. So I was reading Susan Sontag, I was reading Sylvia Plath, but again, it was a very kind of like white canon, white Western canon, even when I was
Sure.
reading women. And like when I went to grad school, I actually went to a program at University of Rochester where I don't know if any of your listeners are familiar with Christopher Lasch.
I was going to say, isn't that where Lash was before he
Yeah, it
died?
was his department. So Lash it was a very complex,
Were you
controversial.
there when he was there, or was he
I
already?
wasn't. No.
I can't
He
remember
had
when he
passed
died.
away many years earlier. I was actually friends with his daughter though, who's also a
Oh,
professor.
wow.
Um, but but I was also like I studied under some of his proteges or some of his colleagues
Mm-hmm.
who had been kind of trained up in a similar kind of way of thinking, which again was very like white and Western for the most part, but was also very critical of American society from all different types of angles, mostly critical of capitalism and imperialism. So I like Lash again, for those that who might not know, he's complicated because he kind of had like a late life conservative turn, particularly on questions of gender. He was basically an
He's hard to
anti-feminist.
code, though. Yeah.
Yeah. He was basically an anti-feminist. And you know, there were other aspects. He was against like school busing, so his racial politics wasn't exactly in line with the left at the time either. But he was a fierce critic of the capitalist imperialist status quo, and there's a lot. I mean, the one book that just totally blew me away was The True and Only Heaven, which is kind of his like that's his big book that he wrote, and it reads very easily. I mean, he's a beautiful writer, and it's a beautiful book, and
Mm-hmm.
you know, it's definitely something that people should wrestle with. But later on in my studies, I eventually ended up discovering, I pointed to it earlier. You had mentioned Angela Davis. So I ended up really like spending a lot of time with the black intellectual, black radical tradition. I read a lot of Angela Davis. I read uh, a lot of like contemporary writers that write about that tradition. So I read, well, CLR James, author of Black Jacobins,
Yeah.
Cedric Robinson, Black Marxism, Nikhil Singh, who's written a number of,
Oh, he's very good. Yeah.
yeah, really solid books. Singh actually kind of like functioned as a guide for me through these intellectual traditions. So
Hmm.
I think really, if you were to like force me to answer that question, I would say it's probably like the black intellectual radical tradition, and particularly the black anti-imperialist tradition, and to a lesser extent the indigenous anti-imperialist tradition. Although I'm not as well read in the indigenous tradition as I ought to be, but you know, I think those two influences have played a major role in shaping my thinking on a lot of these questions.
Yeah, that's interesting. Um, in what might have been your, I don't know if this was like the first time you published in a sort of left aligned outlet or not, but in 2012 you wrote for Dissent magazine, which,
Yep.
like, side note is like Dissent is by far my favorite periodical. But your
Great.
piece in that in 2012, it was like a different world. I mean, like, it wasn't cool to be on the left basically at that point. Like, Obama had sort of shifted what being on the left even meant for a while. But
Right.
like you talk about how the left could win over the military, and culturally, obviously, that is counterintuitive. But it was a great piece. You make a good case, and that's 2012. So a decade later, we have not won. The left has not won over the military, right? Like there are strongholds with, you know, vets for peace, left flank, common defense, but military culture is very much still as you describe it. There's like, and there certainly is like it seems like a prejudice or a tilt toward reactionary politics. So I was wondering if you could like talk about that piece a little bit, or what were you arguing there, and then just reflecting a decade later, why has the argument not panned out? Like the left has not won over the military at this point. Just any thoughts you have about that
Yeah, I mean,
space?
I guess I would be a little qualified. Like, I think the mainstream center left has actually succeeded in winning over, I believe, a majority of the officer class, um,
Hmm.
particularly senior leadership.
Yeah,
So in a way,
like
um,
mainstream Democrats.
yeah. Like, I
Yeah,
mean, I think like the majority of like, at least in polling and all the studies that have been done, I believe like the majority of military officers like were opposed to Trump. At
yeah.
least I might be wrong about that, but I believe that was like the majority of the research pointed in that direction.
Mm-hmm.
Um, and if any, even if it wasn't a clear majority, I think it was, but even if it wasn't, it was like it was a plurality, and relative to the Trumpists, relative to the enlisted ranks, that's really where you unfortunately saw a lot of the Trumpism in the military was actually enlisted ranks. And to this day, a
Mm-hmm.
lot of the far right politics, you have some, don't get me wrong, there's plenty of far right officers, but um, unfortunately, a significant portion of it is enlisted ranks. And in that way, the same thing you're seeing at a global level, this kind of educational polarization between the educated and by educated I mean people with 4-year college degrees or above that, and people
Mm-hmm.
that don't have those degrees. That seems to be like the primary determinant in one's politics, or it's increasingly becoming a primary determinant or the primary determinant, which is really disturbing, especially if you're on the left, because the very people that you need in a left struggle are poor and working people,
Workers.
and
Yeah.
people that don't have 4-year college degrees or graduate degrees. So in some ways, it's even worse than like the left not winning the military. Like the left has ended, or the military has ended up replicating this kind of educational polarization that you're seeing around the world, and this makes it a lot harder to see the kind of military-based politics that I was arguing for in 2012, which was
Mm-hmm.
basically, I was saying, and I still believe this, that like most people in the military are like perfectly primed to be amazing, like reformers or radicals or leftists or labor, especially labor organizers. I focus on that. Like the military does train you in a lot of good stuff, particularly when it comes to like leadership and taking initiative and taking risk, and
They can be servants
solidarity.
of the people in a real sense. Yeah.
Yes, and
Yeah.
solidarity and like the ideals and the values are all there. And a lot of the most successful reformers and radicals have military backgrounds, and that's why. Um, but unfortunately, because of this educational polarization, which easily plays into the presiding culture wars,
Yeah.
it's just so hard to like win over the majority of the enlisted ranks when it comes to the kinds of politics that I have and I that you have, because there's just basically our politics runs on all sorts of different kinds of resentments, like group
Mm-hmm.
resentments. So instead of like actually talking about like our real problems and how we can work together to solve these problems, um like our entire media universe is about like continuing to like get us to hate the groups that we already are suspicious of. And
Mm-hmm.
one of the major dividing lines is obviously like people that have had tough lives, that don't have 4-year college degrees, that have had to take the orders from people with 4-year college degrees or graduate degrees, that have lived much more comfortable lives.
Yeah.
And basically all the right needs to do is like, those people are your enemy, and most of them vote Democrat. And if you vote Republican, then that, like, you're giving them one really big middle finger. And that is the best politics we can hope for in the near to or even far future. And I don't have the answer to how to solve this one. I think it's, I mean, I think the answer always comes down to social movements and labor organ. I'm also an electoral politics person, but I think ultimately the backbone of any kind of answer to this education polarization problem is going to be just a lot of hard work on the part of a lot of people in all sorts of communities, rural, exurban, suburban, and of course the cities. But I think in a lot of cities, this type of work is already happening.
Yeah.
And I do think the labor movement, like, there's been a lot of research done on, like, the labor movement was the most effective way to educate people without 4-year college degrees and graduate degrees.
And it's coming back. Yeah.
Yeah. And there's a, as our economy got deunionized, a lot of working people that were getting educated in labor halls and were meeting all sorts of different people on the front lines of the labor struggle, and that was effective, basically leading them to a more pluralistic, more progressive politics. Once that went away, it was much easier for someone like Tucker Carlson, who's a rich kid, heir, to come in and feed them the resentment fuel from day to day. And so,
do you think for left recruitment, if you want to call it that, but like winning over sections of people to the left's arguments, do you think that the officer class is more gettable than enlisted service people, or vice versa? Like we're not doing great on either front, obviously, because it's basically like the officers are PMC, or like, have like a neoliberal politics, it seems like sometimes, but then the workers should be lined up, but they're obviously like supporting Trump disproportionately. It's like, do you see one constituency as harder to get than the other, or easier to get than the other?
Yeah, I mean, again, I think you can ask the same thing with the broader educational polarization. Are people with college degrees and graduate degrees, are they more likely to move to a real kind of anti-capitalist and anti-imperialist politics than people without those degrees? The sad, unfortunate answer is yes, they are. But from my perspective, that is more testament to the death of unions in this country, and I should say unions, but I'm talking about a broader labor struggle that also involves like housework, domestic labor, and all sorts of kinds of labor that isn't or hasn't been unionized. But without, in the absence of the labor struggle, there's just not much opportunity there. So it's not like, I'm not saying, like, I think if all things are equal, I think people that work every day are more likely to be anti-capitalist than people that, aren't working, every second of every day, or working multiple jobs and barely catching sleep.
The more precarious you are, the more likely you are to be, resistant to the system in some way.
Yeah, and I think that's absolutely true. And I think all things being equal, the more likely you are to adopt like something like an actual anti-capitalist politics. But because of the right-wing revolution we've seen in this country for half a century, and also around the world, the means by which working people have arrived at something like an anti-capitalism, those means are no longer available. They're not as available as they need to be. So I don't think, like, there's some people that make the argument that it's a lost cause and we should just invest in people with 4-year college degrees and graduate degrees and hope they all move left. I think that's ridiculous. I
That's
mean, I
basically
think,
what the Democratic Party did in the 70s. I mean, that's like the Atari Democrat move, you know?
yeah, right. Like that's an interesting story there, because originally, like, the Atari Democrats were a more complex beast than
Yeah.
the neoliberals that we know
What they
today.
became. Yeah.
Yeah, the hope was that you could kind of turn all professionals into you could still have a kind of Rooseveltian New Deal politics with the base being the professionals,
Mm-hmm.
and particularly in the tech world. And obviously that did not happen. Yeah, and I think that's a good, like, warning. Now, I'm not someone who says we shouldn't try to. I come from an upper middle class background. Of course, I'm not saying, like, we need everyone. And I think absolutely, as things right now stand, like, people with 4-year college degrees or more than that, like,
Mm-hmm.
are easier gets. But that means we should continue to try to get those people, and we also need to. And I say we, you know, I'm not doing nearly as much work as I should be to even earn the the grand we right now in this conversation. But I do think, that we have to find a way to. I mean, I think that my one real, like, hope at the moment is that there is a labor revival, and there's all sorts of
Yeah.
strikes taking place. And I follow Labor Notes, like, religiously, which is a great publication if anyone wants to learn more about the labor movement. And
Yeah.
a lot of my friends are labor organizers, and I'm well, I can't. There's other stuff I can't even. There's stuff that I'm doing on the side that's labor related. So yeah, I don't know. I'm going off on a tangent now, but
It's all good, man.
yeah.
Yeah, that's what you're here for. I do have one final question, and it's kind of like a big fat one. And you have this quote in the book. You say, "Why has the country most successful at accumulating private wealth and power, in large part through the unmatched imposition of public violence at home and abroad, also proven one of the least successful at dispensing a baseline quality of life for its residents?" End quote. So this is the kind of question and, like, obvious hypocrisy that really pushed me left the last 5 years. It's the contradictions and the hypocrisies when I look at what we're supposed to be versus what we are, that 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 are, like, almost radicalizing. So, like, what is your answer to this question that you pose? Why is the world's richest, most violent oligarchy so terrible at providing for its citizens' basic needs? Parting shot.
Yeah, I mean, privatization, either the privatization of resources, the
Mm,
privatization of the wealth that comes of those resources, the privatization of actual labor in a collective sense, like what we
mhm,
actually end up laboring on a regular basis, on a daily basis. All of that basically is about ripping agency and ripping control from most people, and handing that agency and handing that control to a very small group of people. And that's not going to end well. If there's anything that makes us human, it's our agency, or at least our belief or conviction of our own agency and our own control.
yeah.
And when you rip that from people, and when the majority of people no longer have much control in what they have to do while they're awake, or even how much control they have as far as how many hours they get to be awake or how much sleep they get, you're going to end up with a lot of angry, miserable, unhealthy people. If you add on top of that the amount of violence that is required to get most people to wake up every morning and do the kinds of jobs that they are doing without nearly at all the kinds of rewards that you would think that they would get from the kind of labor they're doing.
Mhm.
And by violence, I mean obviously police violence, but also all the violence that takes place abroad in order to constantly secure more and more markets, more and more cheap resources, more and more cheap labor. Um, that violence, obviously, and this has been, we've talked about this throughout this discussion, that violence brings in all sorts of other consequences and symptoms that are profoundly unhealthy and dangerous and self-reproducing. So yeah, like if you were to like try to build a society that is just full of deeply unhealthy and angry and potentially violent people at any given moment, it would be the society that the United States has created. And I don't want to make it seem like the United States is alone in this achievement. The United States has been following in the footsteps, like I said earlier, of many other European powers and empires. And, many societies outside of Europe have also been incredibly exploitative and incredibly violent. But the societies that have played the most central role, or at least have the most power in the global society that we have today, are those in the global north, particularly in Europe, United States, Australia, and so on. So that's where I tend to focus my own critique.
Good answer, man. Well, thanks for coming on the show. This has been roller coaster of emotions. I've enjoyed it. Enlightening too. A great compliment to the book. You have got listeners, watchers, viewers. You should buy this book. It's called Pain is Weakness, Leaving the Body, a Marine's Unbecoming. The author is Lyle Jeremy Rubin. Any like parting things you want to shout out, or the answer can be no. Anything that you want to mention, or?
I mean, no, I guess the only thing I want to, whenever I speak at schools, like the first thing I say is like, this is my story. I'm not here to tell you the truth. I'm here to tell you my truth, or a collection of truths that I have stumbled upon. And I really want you, the people I'm listening to just like not agree with me, but at least use this experience to think more about the types of stuff that I'm talking about. And I guess that's kind of like the parting message I would leave for everyone listening to this. Like, not only do I not want you to agree with everything I said, because I'm not even sure I fully agree with everything I said. I'll probably have all sorts of doubts after I finish this podcast about a number of things I just said. But I would ask, everyone to at least use this conversation as an opportunity to explore some of the questions and topics that we've explored, and maybe pick up some of the books that we mentioned, or the studies that we mentioned, and figure it out on your own.
Yeah, I'm going to throw as much as I can into the show notes on Césaire and William James and such.
Yeah,
thanks for doing this again.
Yeah. Oh, no problem. One of my great vices is I just like, if you get me started, I'll spend like 90% of the time just recommending books and articles. So
you need your own podcast.
Answer that. Yeah, right.
Yeah. All right, man. Well, this is great. Thanks again for doing it.
Yeah. Thank you so much, Van. It was a real pleasure, and you have a good one.
Yeah, you too. All right. So